This week, a study was recently published about young Jewish adults, and I figured it'd be fun to talk a little bit about it. I'm a huge nerd for this kind of thing, so sorry in advance, but maybe you'll be surprised by some of the results. And this Friday is Juneteenth, a holiday that is finding its way into the Jewish calendar. Let's dive in. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So a couple of things before getting into this study, put together by a company called Atlantic 57 and sponsored by the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Family Foundation, the Genesis Philanthropy Group, the Jim Joseph Foundation, and the Maimonides Fund. It was done before COVID-19 and before Jewish life migrated online to be more openly available to everyone. What this means is that some of the findings could become irrelevant because of the change in access to Jewish programming. But to be honest, I've got a nagging feeling that the attitudes among young Jewish adults found in this study are still around and are probably affecting online programming too. And in a general sense, the results tell a story of how Jewish institutions still kind of suck at engaging young adult Jews and appealing to a broad range of Jews. So let's dive in. The study was done over the course of late 2017 and early 2018 with some phone interviews, some focus groups, and a survey among 1,047 Jews between the ages of 22 to 40 without kids. So late Gen Z and millennials, basically. And the reason for focusing on people without kids is because the needs of Jews with kids are very different than the needs of Jewish young adults on their own. And what's interesting to me is how mundane some of the factoids are out of this research. Survey respondents were about 50-50 on whether they identify their religion as Jewish or identify as Jewish in some other way. That 50-50 trend sticks for whether respondents were raised by one Jewish person or two Jewish people, which is a not so subtle way of asking if their families are intermarried. Combine that with having some people saying that they identify as Jewish, but their religion is Protestant or Catholic Christianity, and we see what everyone in the Jewish world should already know by now. Lots of Jews are coming from intermarried backgrounds. Now, here's where things get a little more interesting. The survey asked what kind of Jewish activities people did growing up, like, going to a Jewish museum, going to a Jewish day school, stuff like that. And here's some of how that broke down. So 47% had a bar or bat mitzvah. 43% attended some kind of Jewish Sunday school. And what about activities that are seemingly so central to a modern Jewish identity? Well, just 27% visited Israel with family or friends, 25% were involved in a Jewish youth group, and 23% attended a Jewish overnight summer camp. Now, this excites me. Okay, maybe excites isn't the right word, but whatever. It's interesting because it highlights the massive gap between the Jews that institutions see and think about and the rest of the Jews that are, to an extent, off the radar. This has been covered in a number of other studies, but when the Jewish institutional world is so focused on youth groups and summer camps as a way of preserving Jewish identity, and then it ends up only a quarter of Jews are actually getting either of those experiences, there's a lot to think about in terms of what kind of Jew these experiences are really built for. For example, a different study of Gen Z Jews and Jewish youth groups published about a year ago found that 80% of the teens in youth groups say that their families are not intermarried. By contrast, 80% of Jewish teens who are not in youth groups do have intermarried families. So you're getting a small and select pool of Jews in institutional Jewish life that is not so representative of most Jews. Then you get to the often debated issue of finances. Summer camps can cost thousands of dollars each summer, and with multiple kids in several programs, these costs can easily get above $10,000, depending on the camp costs of not just the enrollment, but buying all of the stuff for camp that kids need. So how many families are you missing that don't have the money to spend on this stuff in the institutional Jewish world? Now, that's kind of a detour of kid and teen experiences in the institutional Jewish world, and naturally, those experiences will be focused on the people or families who already walk through the doors. But then the question is, if Jewish institutions are so focused on the pool of Jews they already have for these programs, does that lack of attentiveness to other Jews carry over to adult programming? And I should note, this is a generality. There are a lot of Jewish organizations who put a lot of work into reaching as many Jews as possible, but this does seem to still be a problem. And look, it's not like this study gives an answer to the question of, the lack of attentiveness to other Jews in adult programming. But there is a curious statistic. The survey asked Jews what of several options explains why they feel connected to the Jewish community right now. 75% said it's because of their families that they feel connected, which is not really a surprise. But just 34% of the Jews who feel connected to a Jewish community feel connected because of events hosted by Jewish organizations. And to unpack this, because I know this is super in the weeds, but just to understand the context of, in the Jewish world, there is so much hand-wringing and concern over engaging young adult Jews. Millions of dollars are spent on programs, organizations like Moshe House, Chabad Young Professionals, and God knows who or what else. And according to this survey, admittedly from early 2018, but still, just 34% of Jews feel connected to the Jewish community because of the events that Jewish organizations put on. That does not exactly qualify as a resounding success of engagement in my mind. Now, grain of salt. The survey separates out volunteering with a Jewish organization or engaging in advocacy with a Jewish organization as ways of feeling connected to the community. And the published study doesn't explain what they meant when asking if Jews feel connected by going to institutional events. It could be that a lot of Jews do go to these events and are being engaged in some way, but it's just a smaller number that actively feels connected to the community writ large because of the events. And yes, this is a ton of conjecture and some big what-ifs, but I'm not going to pretend to have the answers here, but I am going to enjoy raising these questions that I think continue to be central to how the American Jewish world evolves into the 21st century. At minimum, it's relevant to ask how much good millions of dollars of philanthropic spending are doing when the impact maybe doesn't totally add up. But there is a flip side to this, in that it's not all on the Jewish organizations. Young adult Jews tend to have very different ideas about what engaging with Judaism should mean or look like. On a basic level, for lots of young adult Jews, there's just no room in the schedule for Jewish engagement. So between school, work, whatever else is happening in life, it can get really exhausting to put yourself through another thing with more people. Then you add in other factors, like one focus group participant pointing out that institutional Jewish communities can be really cliquey and not do so well with outsiders. And I'm just going to say it, Minnesota has a particular reputation of Jewish cliquiness. So it's not like this stuff is just like in the air general results about Jewish communities overall. This stuff is like in our backyard. But also for a lot of young Jews, they just drift away from Jewish life as young adults. Honestly, I'm guilty of this. I don't really like going to synagogue, and I'm really quite uninterested in being pulled into institutional events. For me, it's part, I want me time to be me time, especially when I'm emotionally burnt out and I don't want to go anywhere. And also, I just have an aversion to institutional Jewish spaces where I feel that, as a young person, there's always someone pulling on my arm to come do this or stand here or be an object of interest. For other young Jews, it may just be as simple as they're not interested in being involved in the Jewish community right now. But then there are other big factors for why Jews aren't engaging so much, like education level. 31% of Jews who feel disconnected from the Jewish community say that they feel disconnected because they feel that they don't know enough about Judaism. And that's something people brought up in focus groups for this study too, of feeling like an idiot in Jewish spaces because they don't know what's going on. And truthfully, Jewish education is hard. There's a lot to know and remember and understand and learn about, but that turns into a huge barrier for entry because not only do many Jews feel self-conscious, but then they may not have the time or money to spend on learning, and Jewish institutions may not be focused on going through the effort of reaching these Jews and helping them get educated. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got a million different Jewish organizations all fighting to educate Jews, and it turns into the alphabet soup problem of duplicated efforts with unknown success about how well reach is actually going. That's some of the frustration of the Jewish world, is both of those things can be true. Let's also not forget that some Jews feel disconnected and uninvolved in Jewish life because they're LGBTQ or Jews of color, something focus groups members also brought up, of feeling like outsiders in the mainstream Jewish community. But interestingly enough, 22% of racially diverse Jews feel very connected to the Jewish community compared to 10% feeling very connected among white Jews, which is kind of interesting. And then you get to some ideas that some focus group members threw out, like engaging young adult Jews by having a traditional Jewish rye bread baking class, or getting people together for Friday night dinner for Shabbat, but not calling it Shabbat dinner because, quote, "Do you want me to come over for Shabbat dinner?" seems way more serious or structured than "Do you want to grab dinner?" a young adult said. Something about labeling it like "let's do Shabbat," it just sounds kind of old-fashioned, end quote. And that's something that truthfully is really frustrating to hear, because among the many things Jewish professionals beat each other up over is whether it's best to have young adult engagement events that have Jewish substance, or just like, hey, let's get some Jews together at a bar kind of thing. And I can't tell you how many program descriptions or bits I've seen from Jewish professionals advertising their young adult programs that are like, this isn't one of these schmaltzy, silly Jews and beer events. This is for real. And it's hard to know what to do when hearing Jews say, we want to get together for dinner because we like Jews and dinner, but don't call it Shabbat. Like, then what's Jewish about it? I mean, look, truthfully, it bugs me, and it makes knowing how to spend millions of dollars of Jewish philanthropic funds on young adult Jewish engagement that much harder, because even if the Jewish world magically puts together informal programs that get Jews into a room with other Jews, I mean, seriously, what's the point if there's no Jewish substance? Which, I should point out is just my opinion. But there is a plus side in that 55% of Jewish young adults in this study say they feel Jewish when eating Jewish food. So that's a window of opportunity for meaningful engagement, despite my gripes at some of the focus group comments. But the bigger point here is not only is there a question of how successfully Jewish organizations are engaging young adult Jews, but there's a pretty legitimate sigh of frustration when Jewish organizations are trying to engage young adult Jews who are a little hard to know how to engage. And in getting in the weeds on this, just to zoom out and put in some context again, when we're talking about Jewish life in the United States or Jews in the United States, the organized institutional Jewish community still paves the way more often than not for a feeling of being centrally connected and not just a bunch of Jews spread out in the same country. So it's always relevant to look at the big ways that connecting our community isn't working so well, and it's always relevant for Jews inside the institutional world to think about who we're missing, be it other Jews generally, Jews of color or LGBTQ Jews specifically, lower income Jews, and I don't mean this as a way to pile on Jewish professionals in our institutions. In my experience, Jewish professionals are often the people thinking most about this stuff. Really, I think that the people that need to hear this are actually just the Jews that are part of the central Jewish communities that are organized around these institutions. And I just want to share the last paragraph of this study because it has kind of a great optimistic angle on reaching young Jews and understanding what to appeal to in bringing more people into institutional Jewish life. Quote, on the whole, today's Jewish young adults are compassionate, active in exploring new activities, and generally proud of being Jewish. In focus groups, participants were prompted with certain lines, such as, I am Jewish and blank. Seemingly speaking for the entire young adult age group, one focus group participant wrote down just one word: curious. End quote. And now to pivot to something a little different, there's an American holiday that is turning into a cultural movement, and there's a push to adopt it in the Jewish world. So let's talk about Juneteenth for a moment. Juneteenth celebrates Black Americans' emancipation from slavery, but the story behind the holiday is not straightforward. Most people know of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1862 during the Civil War, that technically freed slaves in Confederate states. But it's not like everyone got an email about it, and the news took time to spread, and many slave owners just didn't tell their slaves about it. Texas was among the last holdouts of Confederate power and on not freeing its slaves, so in 1865, on the 19th of June, Union Major General Gordon Granger issued an order for Texas, saying that all the slaves were free. And again, the news still took a while to get around, and slave owners delayed telling their slaves they were actually free, but the day became a holiday in Texas celebrating freedom, and then it spread to the rest of the United States. And now it's becoming a national holiday, not just a holiday in the Black community. For example, Target, Best Buy, and US Bank literally just made Juneteenth a company holiday. And for a few years now, there's been a push in the Jewish community from Jews of color to get Juneteenth to be on our calendar and for Jews to celebrate this holiday of American freedom in solidarity with Jews of color and Black people in the United States. Now, this does raise a question of, what celebrating Juneteenth in the Jewish community should or can look like. And truthfully, I don't know. From looking around and doing some research, the holiday can be celebrated in lots of different ways. Families can take the day to teach kids about the legacy of slavery in America. Some Jews of color have been celebrating Juneteenth like a Passover Seder with a similar structure and a Haggadah and an order to commemorating the holiday, remembering slavery, and celebrating freedom. There are local Juneteenth celebrations that, because of the current pandemic, are also accessible online. And this year is extra special because June 19th is this Friday, so it's like a holiday going into then the holiday of Shabbat. And with that Jewish connection, there's a musical Kabbalat Shabbat Juneteenth service that will be streamed on Zoom, organized by Bechol Lashon and Keshet, two Jewish organizations working with diverse Jews. Two female rabbis of color are going to be leading, Rabbi Sandra Lawson and Rabbi Isama Goldstein-Stoll, and the link to this service will be in the podcast notes if you want to tune in. There will also be links to some op-eds about Judaism and Juneteenth in the podcast notes as well. So I guess this is an invitation, because while there's lots of work to be done to end the legacy of slavery and racism in the United States and in our Jewish community, Juneteenth seems like a good place to start. Not as a thing to do to then feel like we've done enough, like, oh, I'm celebrating this holiday, what else do you need from me? But really as a place to start putting the work in to address and educate ourselves about long-standing issues of race in the United States, and really to also celebrate an important moment of freedom in America. So do some Googling, do some reading, and let's make this Friday, June 19th, Juneteenth, a meaningful holiday. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.